The river had always been Emma's refuge, a place where the sound of rushing water drowned out the noise of a world that had grown crueler with each passing season, and though she sat there now with her dress muddied and her tears tracing pale lines down her cheeks, she could not leave it. The river had been her cradle of laughter once, echoing with the voices of her father teaching her to cast stones and her mother's laughter floating on summer evenings, and the memory of those days tugged at her heart like a ghost that would not let go. The land around her seemed so wide and merciless, stretching into the horizon where cattle grazed on dried grass, where fences sagged under the weight of years, and where every farmhouse carried the same silent grief of folks who worked themselves raw just to keep the roof overhead. Emma was no stranger to hardship, but the blow of losing her father to fever had shattered her like nothing else, and the debts that followed left her family teetering on the edge of ruin. Her younger brother had left to find work in the rail camps, her mother grew weaker by the day, and Emma felt the burden of holding together a home that was slipping through her fingers no matter how tightly she clung. She wept there by the river because it was the only place she could allow herself to fall apart, and for a long while she let the sobs come freely, her small hands gripping the earth, her chest aching with the question no one could answer: how does one fill silence with joy again after it's been stolen? She thought she was alone, but then the crunch of boots on gravel pierced the rhythm of the river, and her breath caught as she wiped quickly at her face, though tears still clung stubbornly to her lashes. He emerged from the shadows of cottonwoods like a figure cut from the land itself, tall and weather-worn, his hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much, spurs glinting faintly in the dying light of sunset. Caleb McGraw, known in town only as the Cowboy, moved with a patience that told of long roads traveled and battles fought silently in the chambers of his soul. He had worked cattle, driven herds, fought off rustlers, and carried scars across his arms that were matched only by the invisible ones in his heart. But here, by the river, he did not look like the hardened man people whispered about, he looked instead like someone who recognized the language of grief. He stopped a few feet away, tipping his hat in a gesture of respect, and when Emma did not rise or speak, he lowered himself carefully to sit on the grass beside her, leaving enough distance that she would not feel cornered, yet close enough that she knew she was no longer alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy at first, then strangely comforting, and Emma realized that Caleb's quiet was not the quiet of indifference but of a man who understood the weight of words and the deeper weight of letting them rest unspoken. The river filled the space for them, its current whispering against the rocks, and Emma found herself breathing a little easier in his presence, though the ache in her chest still burned. At last, her voice broke through, hoarse from crying, fragile as glass. It feels like the world has taken everything, Caleb. I can't hear laughter in this place anymore. Just silence. Her gaze never left the water, as if afraid that looking at him might shatter her fragile courage. Caleb's jaw tightened, his profile cast in the amber glow of the setting sun, and when he finally spoke, it was in that steady drawl that carried both grit and gentleness. "World's mighty cruel sometimes," he said, "but it don't steal everything, Emma. Not forever. Rivers dry up, storms roll through, but the water finds its way back. And so will laughter. You'll see." His words weren't grand, yet they carried the weight of a vow, the kind a man makes only when he means it deep down to the marrow of his bones. She turned to him then, her eyes red but searching, and she saw something in his face, an unspoken promise, born not of pity but of shared sorrow, as if he too had stood where she stood now. For the first time in weeks, Emma's lips trembled toward a smile, small and fleeting, but real. Caleb caught it, and though he did not smile himself, his eyes softened, the faintest glimmer of light piercing through the storm that seemed to follow him always. The air around them grew cooler as dusk settled in, cicadas giving way to the low hum of crickets, and lanterns from distant ranch houses flickered like stars against the darkening land. Emma hugged her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them, and whispered, "Do you really believe it? That this place can be filled with laughter again?" Caleb leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his hat tilted low, and in a voice roughened by dust and years of loss he answered, "I don't just believe it. I promise it. And I don't break promises, Emma." The world seemed to pause at that moment, the river slowing, the sky darkening, as though the land itself was bearing witness to his vow. Emma closed her eyes, letting the words settle inside her like a seed buried in soil, fragile but with the chance to bloom. She did not know what tomorrow held, nor how they would claw their way back to joy, but she felt, for the first time in too long, that perhaps she was not standing at the edge of ruin alone. Caleb's presence was a reminder that strength could be borrowed, that grief could be shared, and that promises, when spoken under a sky vast enough to hold them, could be strong enough to build a future upon. The dawn after that promise broke like fire across the plains, streaks of red and gold spilling over the horizon as if heaven itself had decided to set the world ablaze with hope. Emma rose early, her eyes still heavy but her spirit strangely lighter, as though Caleb's vow had been stitched into her soul overnight. The farmhouse groaned with age, its boards creaking under every step she took, and the kitchen smelled faintly of wood smoke and the herbal tea her mother clung to like a lifeline. She moved quietly, preparing bread and thin coffee, her thoughts drifting constantly back to the river and the way Caleb's voice had carved itself into her heart. She hadn't expected him to appear there, hadn't expected anyone to see her weep, and yet the memory of his presence felt less like intrusion and more like a gift she hadn't known she needed. Outside, the land stretched vast and silent, and Emma knew the day would demand work, mending fences, feeding what little livestock they still had, and facing the reality that the bank's notice sat folded on the table like a vulture waiting for its prey. But somewhere beneath all that dread was a spark of defiance, a whisper that said perhaps she could fight, perhaps the story wasn't over. Caleb was already at the edge of their property when Emma stepped outside, his horse tethered loosely to the fence, its coat glistening with morning dew. He tipped his hat as she approached, and though he spoke little, his actions filled the space his words left bare. He had brought tools slung across his saddle, hammers, nails, rope, and without asking, he began helping her mend the fence line that had collapsed in the night wind. Emma worked beside him, her hands raw but determined, and though they spoke only in fragments, short exchanges about cattle, the weather, the stubbornness of the land, she felt as though entire conversations passed between them in the silence. His presence was steadying, his quiet strength bleeding into her weary frame, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel crushed by the weight of the farm's demands. By midday, sweat slicked their brows, and Emma found herself laughing, a small, surprised laugh that escaped her chest when the hammer slipped and Caleb caught it just before it struck her foot. He raised an eyebrow, muttered, "Close call, darlin'," and though his tone was dry, she caught the faint twitch of a smile at the corner of his lips. It was fleeting, but it was real, and Emma's heart stuttered at the sight. She realized then what he had meant by his promise, not that joy would magically return, but that it would creep back slowly, like sunlight after a storm, through moments so small they might be missed if not cherished. The afternoon brought shadows of another kind. A rider approached from town, dust rising behind his horse, and Emma's stomach tightened when she recognized the sheriff's deputy carrying a folded paper. The notice of foreclosure had come. The man spoke bluntly, apologetic yet firm, warning that unless payment was made within the month, the farm would be seized. Emma stood frozen, her throat tightening, until Caleb stepped forward, his frame casting a shadow over her smaller one. His voice was low but steady, steel beneath the calm. "She heard you, deputy. Now ride on." The man hesitated under Caleb's gaze, then nodded and left, but the weight of his words lingered like a noose around Emma's neck. That night, Emma sat by the river again, her heart heavy with the inevitability of loss, but this time she wasn't alone. Caleb joined her without needing an invitation, settling beside her with the same patience he had shown before. The moonlight bathed the water in silver, and Emma found her voice trembling as she confessed her fear. "I can't lose this place, Caleb. It's all I have left of them, my father, my childhood, everything. If it goes, I don't know who I'll be." Caleb listened, his silence deep as the river, and after a long moment, he turned to her, his eyes sharp with resolve. "Then we won't let it go. Not without a fight. You hear me? I've seen too much taken by men who think they own the world. But this land, this laughter you're clinging to, it ain't theirs to take. Not while I'm standing here." Emma's tears spilled freely then, but they were different from before, they were not only of grief, but of the strange, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, this cowboy who had walked into her sorrow carried the strength to help her rise again. She leaned into him, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his frame, and for the first time since her father's passing, the night did not feel like an enemy. It felt like a promise. The days that followed were heavy with dust, sweat, and worry. The notice from the bank was like a shadow over every moment, and Emma often caught her mother staring at the folded paper with a look of resignation, as though she had already accepted that their land was lost. But Caleb refused to let despair rule the farmhouse. Every morning he was there before the rooster crowed, fixing what was broken, riding to town for supplies, and sometimes simply sitting with Emma by the river when her spirit sagged too low. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words were the kind a person held onto in the quiet hours of the night. Whispers began to spread through the town. Folks wondered why a drifter like Caleb McGraw was giving his time to the widow's daughter, why he worked the fences as if the land was his own. Some said he was running from something, others claimed he owed Emma's late father a debt. Emma never asked. She only knew that when Caleb was near, the silence of her days did not suffocate her the way it used to. But as the deadline for the bank's payment drew closer, hope thinned. They needed money, more than the farm could ever yield in such short time. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Caleb leaned against the porch post, his hat tipped low, and finally said the words he had held back, "There's a rodeo comin' through Amarillo. Big prize money. Dangerous as hell, but, if I ride, I reckon I could win enough to keep this place yours." Emma's breath caught. The thought of him risking his life in the brutal chaos of bucking broncos and wild bulls made her heart twist with fear. "You don't have to do that for us," she whispered. Caleb lifted his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I made you a promise, Emma. I don't back down from that." The week of the rodeo came fast. The town buzzed with talk of it, wagons rolling out toward Amarillo, banners flying, music drifting across the plains. Emma rode with Caleb, her mother too weak to travel, and as they entered the arena, Emma felt her chest tighten. The place was alive with shouting, laughter, the thunder of hooves, and the raw, wild energy of men testing themselves against beasts that wanted nothing but freedom. Caleb stood tall among them, calm as stone, though Emma could see the tension in his hands as he adjusted the worn leather gloves. When his name was called, the crowd roared. Caleb mounted the bull, a massive creature thrashing with fury, muscles rippling under its dark hide. Emma clutched the railing, her heart pounding as the gate burst open. What followed was chaos, dust exploding, the bull leaping and twisting with bone-crushing power, Caleb holding on with every ounce of strength and grit he had gathered through years of hardship. 8 seconds felt like a lifetime. Emma could hardly breathe, her nails digging into the wood, her voice hoarse from shouting his name. But Caleb did not let go. When the horn finally sounded, he flung himself free, landing hard but alive, and the crowd erupted into thunder. He had done it. The prize money was theirs. Enough to pay the bank, enough to keep the farm. But more than that, Emma realized as she ran to him, it wasn't just land he had saved, it was her hope, her laughter, her belief in tomorrow. Caleb, bruised and dusty, pulled off his hat and met her halfway. For a moment the world shrank down to just the two of them in the middle of that roaring arena. She threw her arms around him, tears spilling, and he held her the way he had by the river, strong and unyielding. Into her hair he whispered, "Told you, darlin'. This river's gonna remember our laughter." And it did. Weeks later, as the farm hummed again with life, as the fences stood strong and the hearth glowed warm, Emma found herself by the river with Caleb at her side. This time, there were no tears. There was music, her laughter tumbling across the water as he teased her about her crooked stone skipping, his deep chuckle joining hers, and together their voices filled the evening air. The river, once a witness to sorrow, now carried their joy downstream, a promise kept, a vow fulfilled. The cowboy had given her back her laughter, and in return, Emma had given him something he had not known he was searching for all along, a home.